very much, and good morning. And I firstly must apologise for the Estuary Will Peretti. We're immensely proud of them. They should not be growing in our part of the world, but that's Chelsea and that's London for you. What I'm going to take you through this morning is very much a sort of a practical guide to how we at the Physic Garden, and I think we need to just get some idea of the concept of scale here. I know that we gentlemen are often told that size isn't everything, but my word, you don't get much smaller than Chelsea Physic Garden. This speck of land alongside the Thames, and effectively that's it. Oops, I'm sorry, I'll get used to this and run. There it is there, and slightly closer up there. That speck of land has been the crucible of an immense amount of exceptionally important horticultural and botanical science and development, the practice and the science of horticulture and botany. But that history which dates back to 1673, is something which can sometimes almost be a slight encumbrance, obviously when you're thinking of taking the Botanic Garden forward, particularly in today's world where it saddens me that the idea of history and the romance of history is not something that people necessarily buy into in the same way as we would in this room and many others. So Chelsea Physic Garden, as I already said, 1673, 340 years in existence. But it's only been in existence as a public garden and as a visitor attraction for a mere 30 years. So we opened to the public in 1983. That was almost by force majeure because the organisation that had been funding the garden prior to that decided it no longer fitted with their funding principles, so they stepped back. So the garden either sank or swam, and I'm only too delighted to say that it swam, and very well. This is the crest of the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries of London, who set up the garden in 1673 for the exceptionally laudable aim of training their apprentices. And in that way, it is actually one of the oldest dedicated educational botanical establishments in the world. And it is the golden thread, as it were, that runs right the way through the history of the garden, and that we are obviously working very strongly with to this day, because our charitable purpose, our public benefit, is as an educational establishment. This is a rather fanciful rendition of a load of apothecaries in the 18th century, busy looking at the plants in the garden. The garden very rapidly outgrew its initial concept as a garden dedicated almost entirely to medicinal plants. And the reason why that happened is very much around this gentleman, Sir Hans Sloane, who in 1722 rescued the garden from imminent closure and bankruptcy, and having bought the land on which the garden sat, he donated it to the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries and their resident associates in perpetuity, for as long as the garden be used for the purpose of growing useful plants, that they may better be distinguished from those that are hurtful. It's a remarkably broad covenant when you think about it. So broadly written, and I can assure you, we do an awful lot within that. It covers and encompasses almost anything you might care to think of in ethnobotanical terms, which is where we are now directing the garden, more broadly ethnobotanical than simply medicinal. As I said, the garden is tiny, a mere 1.6 hectares or 3.8 acres. Within that garden, our records, the records which I inherited when I took over as curator 3 years ago, tell us that we have 5,000 taxa. That is a ludicrously diverse living collection, and we are picking up what Andrew was saying about curation of living collections. We have just actually installed Irish Dunedin database, and we are going to now actually audit and review the collections for the first time, as far as I can tell, in many decades, to actually establish just how relevant those plants are to the various policies and strategies which we're laying down. But Sir Hans Sloane, he covenanted the garden. We pay a princely £5 per annum to Earl Dunedin, who is the successor of Sir Hans Sloane, for as long as we continue to use the garden for the purpose of growing useful plants. The land value of that, I think a square centimetre would probably be about £5 per annum, or maybe rather more. So it's a fairly good deal when you think about it. The garden's heyday was undoubtedly in the 18th century. This is a plan drawn of the garden in 1753. The garden was by that time almost certainly, in European terms and therefore in world terms, one of the most important conduits for the introduction of plants from abroad, from the developing economic interests of the British Empire as it was to become, but around this time, because the empire hadn't sort of matured into that. The garden was at the cutting edge of botany, at the cutting edge of horticultural practice. It's very interesting that Linnaeus visited the garden in order to try and convince the then head gardener, Philip Miller, to use his fancy high-polluting binomial system. On his first visit, Philip Miller sent him away. We don't need any of that nonsense. I've got a perfectly good system of naming plants and I'll stick with it. He did have to fit in with Linnaeus in the end. But when I say the garden was at the cutting edge, it really was. But in some ways also, there's great romance about that. Very few gardens have the privilege of being included in the Canaleta painting. Here is the Chelsea Physic Garden. Those are 3 barge houses because the apothecaries had a barge and they rented barge houses to others. And at the back is the building that you see there. On either side of the building are glass houses. Philip Miller, this gentleman on the left, he was probably one of the greatest gardeners in history, certainly of his age. He was at Physic Garden for nearly 50 years, and he wrote the Dictionary of Gardening, of Garden's Dictionary, which ran to 8 editions, and it was on the desk of every serious horticulturist, gardener, and botanist anywhere in the world where people took an interest in that work. And I said that we were at the cutting edge. Well, we were very much so. The glass houses which were developed by 1685 were remarked upon by John Egan, the diarist, who wandered around and he said they had very clever methods of subterranean heat to maintain conditions for tender plants. And he found growing in these glass houses cinchona, quinine. This was, as I say, very much at the cutting edge. This was when these plants were only just being introduced, and so many of them were making their way into cultivation through the Physic Garden. Another plant that entered into cultivation, certainly through the Physic Garden, is Catamaranthus roseus, and that first flower of Chelsea Physic Garden about 1753. And on the left is the painting that was figured in Villas Icones, taken from plants grown at the garden and obviously painted from the line. And this tradition of celebrating plants of the garden in fine artworks very much in the 18th century. Villas Icones is the book to the left. On the right is the wonderful, curious herbal of Elizabeth Blackwell, which was essentially painted from plants in the garden in the 1750s. And she painted these plants, which in their day, of course, these were quite astonishing vegetable objects. Things like pomegranates and figs were the sort of thing that people would visit the Chelsea Physic Garden to marvel at. Because, as has already been alluded to, an appreciation of botany and horticulture was very much considered as an element of the life, a requirement of the life of the cultured person. We continue, interestingly enough, with that tradition to this very day in the Chelsea Physic Garden Flora-Legion Society. On the right is a Campusenia, which grows at the garden, and on the left bank is Serrata again, painting from the life from plants which grow in the garden. And it's quite interesting. I just had an email today. We have an exhibit at the Royal Horticultural Society's halls at one of the botanical painting exhibitions from the Flora-Legion Society, which is going to spreading the word about the marvels of plants that are growing at the Physic Garden, and obviously the marvels of plants in general. Banks here, well, Joseph Banks has already been alluded to on a number of occasions this morning, and he actually grew up in Swanwall. He virtually overlooked the garden. And his early interest in botany and horticulture was undoubtedly nurtured by the phenomenal opportunity that he had to walk through the gates of Chelsea Physic Garden at the time that Philip Miller was in Hidcombe and immerse himself in this remarkable diversity of variety of plants. The garden has, as all gardens do, been through numerous ups and downs, but always a large number of very influential people have been involved. People like Curtis, Professor of Botanical Magazine, Lindley, Forsyth. This is our cool fernery, which was first constructed in 1853. Thomas Moore, who was a very prolific writer on ferns, he was Chelsea Physic Garden curator. The gentleman on the right is Nathaniel Ward, which you'll recognise as a Wardian case. He was chairman of the garden committee at the garden for, I think, 20 years or more. So even when the garden wasn't any longer at the cutting edge, because we had slightly been usurped by our younger sibling down the river at Kew, we still, obviously, were a garden that was greatly cherished, greatly loved, and the work that was going on there, which was scientific research to a degree, but mainly educational work, was considered very worthwhile. This picture was taken in 1899, and this was when the garden moved from the apothecaries to the London Charitable Foundation, which took over its management for about the next 84 years or so. The apothecaries couldn't afford to run it. As you can see, Sir Hans Stone is there. They must have been rather frightened that people with skill his exceptionally heavy statue, because it is surrounded by exceptionally gold railings. They were sold off during the Second World War to make tanks to go and fight Hitler. And we're now awaiting the date for a new stone statue, and we'll have a new clip for it as well. But this was the time when the garden moved, perhaps more specifically, towards research. A lot of the funding for the garden came from the Parochial Foundation for the educational work that we did, but also a great deal of the funding that we received came from, this was a project to look at the effect of light fertilization, dry, I think it was Imperial College who carried out this project. One of the things about all of these things was that they frequently took over, destroyed and completely rebuilt areas of the garden. We'll come back to that in a moment. We still have one or two research collections. It's the fact that researchers left us rather than that we wanted research to leave us. And in this 100-year-old glass house, we have been holding from the Natural History Museum a collection of Warwickshire. We now have Bristol University and Queen Mary University of London also working on plants which we have. I would be only too delighted to have more research carried out on the gardens. Unfortunately, as I say, the people who wish to do the research no longer seem to use botanic gardens or perhaps independent growing facilities such as ours. We have so much of the garden which is a wonderful resource in so many ways and has tremendous character, but is a nightmare to work in. The glasshouse range was constructed between 1901 and 1907. On the right-hand side, you see our tropical corridor. In there, we grow guavas, we grow quinine, we grow papayas, we grow bananas. It is at its highest point about 9 feet deep, each side is 6 feet, and the width of it, we basically do that in the touching course. We have 50,000 visitors a year. When these facilities were built, the garden expected around 2,500 visitors a year, and they would, of course, be very well behaved, and they would not be the sort of people who would complain about difficulties of access or poor interpretation. So they're different purposes. Modern audiences are slightly different to that. This is still the succulent collection of the Chelsea Physic Garden. It is, of its day, perfectly workmanlike, but it is not the sort of collection that is going to engage people's interest and make them wish to delve further into the wonderful world of succulent plants in all their infinite variety. We have to move on from this, but of course, as has already been alluded to, the moment you touch these things, suddenly an awful lot of people emerge from the woodwork, and so you have to couch what you're doing in terms which are compelling for them. And in some circumstances, you of course have to just simply ignore them as long as you have the right people on your side. The wrong people can sometimes just be quietly ignored with a polite letter saying, I appreciate your view. But this is the sort of thing that we're having to work from and move away from. And why are we doing this? Well, because we're no longer a research institute. We are an educational botanic garden. We're a garden that has made baby steps initially in 1983. The garden was open on Sunday afternoons with a volunteer at the gate. It still is slightly cottage industry. When I tell you that the institutional staff of Chelsea Physic Garden is myself as curator, a head gardener, 4 gardeners, and 1 man who runs everything to do with education. That's the school children's program, the adult education program, and everything else. So we do sometimes feel we're a little resource poor in the idea of rich. On the left-hand side there, we have a core of volunteers who help us with guiding. We have volunteers for a manner of reasons, as many of you do, because without it it's absolutely sink. But our volunteer guides, all visitors to the garden and the public, can be guaranteed a tour of the garden with a human face that will explain to them what the garden is about, its history and its purpose. On the right-hand side, where you can see we do adult education lectures, and bottom right, we also do classes in things like cutting medicine and stuff, because there is, of course, a great deal of interest in that these days. But we have, of course, very compelling messages to put across, because the idea of a garden which is related at the bottom, this thing woven in everything we're talking about the conference, is the ensuring that people get a very strong message about environmental conservation. And at the Physic Garden, our particular angle has to be that we can only really talk about plants which relate to people, and if possible, what we like to do is to show them that they have self-interest in environmental conservation and plant conservation, rather than that it's just as it were an abstract, a nice to have, it's a must have. So this is obviously interpretation of collection of medicinal plants, and I'm sorry, put it across in two ways. This, I travelled in Nepal for Q, and I happened across this overcollection of Fickingherium praei in the Terai, foothills of the Himalayas, which has been collected in Nepal and then in India, exported to India for Ayurvedic medicine. It is a remarkable image, and it is something which obviously you can all key into straight away. But it's, again, it's a little bit abstract. If you use plants like this as a striator, you're talking about a plant which they grow, which they look at, which they think is beautiful. They will hopefully pick up on that as a more compelling image than the one before, which is the strand. We have tremendous problems that all of the garden is difficult of access, narrow grass paths. The area given over to the pharmaceutical and medicinal collections, you can see it there. Very charming, very difficult to see what's going on, to interpret it or access it. These are the plans which we're going to be putting into action for an entirely new and 3 times the size area of medicinal plants of the garden, going back to our original purpose, but upgrading everything so that it would be far better for our visitors, and we can engage in interpreting the way that we wish to. Talking to them about things that matter. Superfood Summer, this was our display this summer, giving them the real story about what is truly superfood and what is just potentially or allegedly a superfood. And these sorts of things, good displays about things which again people can relate to directly, are very much what we have to be about. Quinoa, it's called United Nations Year of Quinoa, I'm sure you're all aware of that, and it is a genuine superfood. Garlic again. We have to reach out, obviously, to other ethnic groups. London is one of the most ethnically diverse cities in the world. So this was a display with the London American provision ground. And here, a display of spices, trying always to upgrade our interpretation, to make the collections more interesting, to make the displays more interesting and more involving. School children are so important to us. We still train gardeners so that we also have more than 3,000 children a year through the garden. We encourage them to get involved with all manner of practical activities. On the right-hand side, they're curing a new structure which we put up with organic yogurt that was passed itself by date. And as you can see, they got quite involved. And the reason why we're doing that, this is our new gardens of edible and useful plants, which we actually developed in the winter of 2011-2012. And here we're putting into action what we feel are the criteria that we will use for the development of collections in the future. We're creating hopefully larger, more fluid spaces where people can spend time, more garden-esque spaces, because in previous years it wasn't necessary to make them so. And in doing so, we give people a desire to linger, and if you have effective interpretation, the desire to discover as well. So all of this, of course, is immensely time-consuming. We do all of our design work, etc., in-house. Because we are rated Grade 1 under English Heritage Historic Parks and Gardens, we have to ensure that everything passes through the correct channels. This is our new edible garden. And always putting across the message, these plants are for you. Plants are crucial to your future, so therefore, please do sit up, take notice. And even where things are beautiful, this was actually put together to put across another very strong message about the importance of bees, because this is a bee forage bed, in order that we can produce our own Chelsea Physic Garden honey, which wins many awards. And that sort of thing is a direct link which people will pick up on very clearly, and hopefully it's a very powerful and potent message. And that brings us to, we have, of course, a mission statement which we redefined just a year ago. Very simple, to demonstrate the medicinal, economic, cultural, and environmental importance of plants to humankind. And that's what the Physic Garden effectively has always been about. And as still a European visitor attraction, that's what we hope to be about for the foreseeable future. Thank you very much.